us to do every day. Give you a little bit of information about those colleagues. So I don't quite know what happened to the PowerPoint presentation, but we'll roll. Okay, awesome. So being justice involved and what reentry means for our community and us. Maybe. All right. I got nothing. Let's try it again. Okay, there we go. We got it. So we talked a little bit. Oh, okay. So as we talked about a little bit last week, the national statistics, people are sent to jails and prisons 7 million times per year. This is the revolving door as known as recidivism, right? Where people are in, they're out. They're in, they're out. 7 million times each and every year. By the second quarter of fiscal year 22, so that was last year, second quarter, 1.8 million people were incarcerated in the United States. That is a lot of people. As we talked about again last week, 600,000 people are released every single year across the United States from incarceration. That is a mass amount of people that I think oftentimes gets overlooked and underutilized. If we had 600,000 people released from institutions and we opened up our job markets, our churches, our businesses, our organizations to those demographic of people, I think every vacancy we have would be filled. Thank you. 1 in 3 adults have a criminal record. I share that statistic because sometimes we look around the room and I know I have the tendency to think, there's no way there's people in this room right now that have a criminal record. Statistics show 1 in 3 people. So you can look around the room, figure out who has the criminal record, but there's a couple people like, no, it's not me, I promise. 30,000 people are arrested every single day. 30,000 people. That's a lot of people. If you look over the city of Canton, think about 30,000 people in your city every day being arrested. And here's some state statistics. In 21, Ohio had an incarceration rate of 828 people per 100,000. This totaled 97,340 convictions in 2021 alone in Ohio. Almost the population of Ohio itself. That is a lot of people. The population of Ohio itself, I think, is somewhere around like 101,000, something like that. Could be off, but 10 million? Okay, 10 million, sorry. I said 101,000, I was way off. But still, think about that, almost 10%, right? Almost 10%, 1% of the entire population. 1% of Ohio's population. Ohio incarcerates people at a rate of 659 people per 100,000, while the U.S. rate of incarceration is 664 people. The entire United States has an incarceration rate of 664, and we are essentially 5 people away from the nation as a state. The next highest rate of incarceration in any other nation is 129 people per 100,000. That means that Ohio by itself incarcerates more people than the United Kingdom, Canada, and France combined. That's heavy. That's a lot of people for one state in the United States. 78,000 Ohio residents are incarcerated as of March 31st of this year, by the way. And 95% of people incarcerated in Ohio will return home. If you want some further demographics on this, you can look up Prison Policy Initiative. This is where those statistics are from. And then Stark County statistics. We talked a little bit about this last week as well, that Stark County sends more people to prison than they can hold in their local county jail. 651 people were sent to prison by Q2. I always try to go pre-pandemic numbers because I think the pandemic shifted things for us. So I try to give people a little bit of grace and a little bit of, just flex there. But in 2019, there were only 173 people that were in the Stark County jail. So almost, I would say quadruple what the Stark County jail is able to hold was sent to prison. It's a lot of people. In 2015, we talked about this number last week, 3,412 people were released back to Stark County. Only 564 of those individuals released back were served through reentry services. Again, a huge gap of about 2,700 people. 1 out of every 3 people released to Stark County will return back to prison within the first year of their release. And I venture to say that is because of the gap of the 2,700 people that were not served through reentry services. So here are some disparities in the justice system just to think about. Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons across the country at nearly 5 times the rate of white people. Latinx people are 1.3 times as likely to be incarcerated than non-Latinx whites. 12 states are more than half of the prison population being black, and 7 states with a disparity between black and white imprisonment as a rate of more than 9 to 1. So for every 1 person that is white who is incarcerated in these states, 9 people of color are incarcerated. And that's Alabama, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Black male offenders continue to receive longer sentences than similarly situated white male offenders. Black male offenders receive sentences on average 19.1% longer than those who were similarly situated. Think about that. Almost 20% more time for people with similar crimes. Nationally, 1 in 81 black adults in the U.S. are currently serving time in state prisons. 1 in 81. Black children are born in 2001 had a 1 in 3 chance of serving time at some point in their life. 1 in 3 chance for kids simply born 2001 and later. While white children had a 1 in 17 chance. So how has the justice system led to mass incarceration? We got to talk about this because I think this is important for us to understand and why those disparities exist. In the 1970s, Nixon criminalized drugs like marijuana, which many believe brought harmful stereotypes to the hippies and the anti-war left population. Additionally, Nixon's harsh punishment for drugs like heroin and crack cocaine crippled the black community in the 1970s, creating stereotypes and harsh jail sentences for black and brown people. Criminalizing drugs like heroin and crack cocaine was not just created to penalize black Americans, as an overdose from these drugs can be fatal, right? We want to be gracious in our conversation. Basically, what this is stating is that it wasn't just to penalize them, right? It was also because there were some safety concerns. People are dying. And so in order to, prevent people from dying, there has to be some type of policy or something like that to help guide and govern that. Nixon believed drug use, especially when done by the youth, was a social rebellion You know, the rock and roll music back in the heyday, right? You remember that? Rap music, you know, that was kind of my era. Negatively impacting and weakening America. Some believe Nixon had underlying motives for his campaigns, including targeting black people in the anti-war left. I just put that suburb in there because I really want you to understand that some people think that. I don't personally think that. I just think he was doing the best he could with what he had. But there are people out there who believe he had ulterior motives. John Ehrlichman, called the Watergate conspirator, spoke out about Nixon's alleged race and anti-war left discrimination. CNN states he candidly admitted the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? This is verbatim John Ehrlichman's quote. Do you understand what I'm saying? How many of us have heard those colloquialisms? I use them a lot in my language. We know we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or to be black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, we could break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. This was John Ehrlichman's quote on CNN. So you say, Stan, how does this show up today? This was in the 60s and 70s. What does this have to do with 2023? I got some books over there for further study if you'd like to learn a little bit more. But a modern effect and a strong example of drug laws, race, and sentencing includes those surrounding crack and powder cocaine. According to the Vox, the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act created a 100-to-1 disparity between the amount of crack cocaine that triggers a federal mandatory minimum sentence versus powder cocaine. You say, Stan, what the heck does this mean? Let me break it down. This means that 5 grams of crack equated to a 5-year sentence, where 500 grams of powder cocaine would warrant the same 5-year sentence. So for 5 grams of crack, you get 5 years in prison. For 500 grams of cocaine, you would get a 5-year sentence. In 2019, officials noticed that 81% of convicted crack offenders were black. Many believe it is because powder cocaine was associated with white populations where crack cocaine was with black populations. So think about this. People that were sentenced to prison for crack cocaine, 81% of them were black. They also received heavier sentences than people who had more grams of cocaine, powdered cocaine. This is a disparity because it was associated that crack cocaine was a plague within the urban America, right? Anybody in here like rap music? Did anybody in here ever hear rap music back in the day? Okay, there was this song specifically, I see no hands going, so I was like, somebody at least had to hear it. But there was actually a song back in the day that kind of highlighted what crack cocaine did in the black community. And essentially, that song made it so nationally wide because of the stereotypes that were associated to crack cocaine being in the black community. I say that because I want you to understand the only difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine is baking soda. Literally an ingredient that, how many of us have baking soda in our house? Yeah, some people, it only looked like 3 people had baking soda. Okay, all right, I'm like, dang, do we not have cookers in the house? But in any event, that is the only difference between. But yet and still, 100-to-1 disparity between sentencing. For some further study, you can read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. That's a book I read. It is very basic entry-level concept of mass incarceration. It talks about the school to prison pipeline, things of that nature, which I myself found myself in. What's prison for? This is a more academia study for those academics in the room. This is actually a college textbook. I have a copy of it if you'd like to just peruse through that. In Their Names by Lenore Anderson. This is a story handwritten for people who have been incarcerated, writing their stories. Basically kind of like a way to connect with people who are justice involved. Until We Reckon, this is more of a faith-based approach to it, right? Where it says, until we reckon with the injustices in our system, we're never going to be able to see the kingdom of God fully in its expression as it's designed to be. And then the Prison Policy Initiative is another resource as well. You say, Stan, why does this even matter? Why should I care about this, right? That's a fair question. Out of the 600,000 people released on average in the United States, 103,000 of them, so you were right, my man, I was way undershooting the population of Ohio. 103,644 men and women are released in Ohio. Incarcerated people are almost 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public. 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public. National research suggests that up to 15% of incarcerated people experience homelessness in the year before they were sentenced to prison. So you want to talk about some preventative work? The people that are homeless, let's start working with them. It's as simple as that. Because 15% of those who are incarcerated were homeless the year before they were incarcerated. People who have been to prison just one time, experience homelessness at a rate nearly 7 times higher than the general public. So one prison sentence, 7 times more likely to be homeless. But people who have been incarcerated more than once have rates that are 13 times higher than the general public. So not only now am I adding another incarceration, but now I've doubled almost the rate in which people are experiencing homelessness coming home from prison. In other words, people who have been incarcerated multiple times are twice as likely to be homeless as those who are returning from their first prison term. I deal with people that are homeless every single day coming home from incarceration. I literally get phone calls Monday through Sunday of people who are coming home or loved ones that are calling to try to find out what type of living arrangement they can secure for their loved one when they're coming home. Every single day here in Stark County. Formerly incarcerated people are unemployed at a rate of over 27%. That is higher than the total U.S. unemployment rate during any historical period, including the Great Depression. So I'm giving you 2 top tier needs for those who are justice involved right now. Literally, it's housing and employment. Research suggests that employers discriminate against those with criminal records, even if they claim not to. How many of us have heard of the Ban the Box movement? There's an application, there was a point in time in our history where on our application, you had to check the box and you had to basically identify if you ever had a criminal background, felony or not. They've recently removed that from all applications. 2019, that was actually fully implemented throughout the entire country. However, even though they no longer have that ban the box, right? They no longer have the box you have to check, there is still a discrimination. I'm going to give you a study that I did myself personally. I have the emails to prove it. I applied from last year until August of this year, so January of 2022 through August of 2023. I applied for 286 jobs here locally in Stark County. Those excluded jobs like at a factory, at McDonald's, Burger King, so on and so forth. I feel like I have a very special and unique expertise in social work, so I applied for positions like that. I got 2 calls back out of those 286, and both of them denied me based on my criminal history, which, by the way, occurred when I was 16 years old. So I want you to know this is a real life thing. And I still, to this day, I'm almost 7 years removed now from my incarceration, and I still, to this day, encounter those barriers. Research suggests that employers discriminate against those with criminal records, even if they claim not to. Although employers express a willingness to hire people with criminal records, evidence shows that having a record reduces a callback by 50%. Instantly, just having a criminal record, half of your applications are getting reeled off. Half of them. In the period immediately following release, formerly incarcerated people are likely to struggle to find housing and attain addiction and mental health support. One of the initiatives that we are doing with the Stark County Reentry Court is that we are trying to connect people to those services. We're trying to make them accessible. We do telehealth. They can literally get their very first orientation kind of connection via telehealth services. This is a way to help kind of reduce the barriers for people trying to attain addiction and mental health services. Everybody who comes home from incarceration has the right to Medicaid or Medicare. So they get that, and that also sometimes pays for their mental health or addiction services, okay? So that's why we're trying to reduce the barrier. It's like, hey, this is already a process that they have in place. Let's just lean into that same process, but make it accessible. How many of us would feel comfortable walking into a mental health or addiction provider right now? Nobody? Couple of people? Cool, awesome. There's a few people. How would you approach that conversation for those who raised your hand? How would you approach that conversation? Go ahead, ma'am. Okay. Mhm. Yeah.
There's just, so what, how do you go about finding providers to take care of when that is bad? Our homeless people, how do you go about finding a really top need?
Mhm.
Maybe we've got to be able to provide things for them, provide their program. But if they need mental health medicine, if they need any of those things, how do you go about?
Yeah, great question. So I think that's threefold, right? So one of the ways that we try to innovatively approach this, everybody on our staff is certified peer recovery supporters. This is Ohio Mental Health and Addiction certification that people with lived experience are trained and equipped to walk with people who either have a substance use diagnosis or a mental health illness diagnosis. And those people walk with those individuals who have a similar life experience. That's one way we're trying to innovatively approach it. That way people are equipped with true proper training and equipping to really truly help people live a life in recovery from both substance use and mental health illness. That's number one. Number two, I think for a congregation like this, it's as simple as possibly you just saying, hey, you know what? Let me go and address my own mental health issues if I have them, or my own substance use disorder issues if I have them, and understand the nuances of the system, right? Because I think it's easy to step from afar back and say, these are the problems with the system. But when you get into them, you'll start learning there's a lot more involved. Transportation is a barrier. I mean, think about, for people who live out in rural communities, SARTA doesn't travel out there. How do they get access to mental health and substance use? Yeah, access to phones, exactly. They're not released with a cell phone. When I came home from incarceration after my 10 years, I didn't know what a smartphone was. I was used to a BlackBerry. That's when I got incarcerated. BlackBerry and MySpace was a thing. And I came home and they had touchscreen phones, and I was like, what the heck is this? Right? Right, affording it, absolutely. So Exactly. So it's a numerous amount of barriers that are deeper than just access to mental health providers. I think making them accessible is a different conversation, right? So we know caseloads are at an all-time high right now, but also making those resources accessible to particular communities is a different conversation. Accessibility is more so of hey, do you have wheelchair ramps out front, right? If you have wheelchair ramps out front, people in a wheelchair are more inclined to come and participate in worship services. There is not a system that has been implemented, at least in our state, where it's a soft handoff. straight from the institution to mental health providers or substance use providers. So I think maybe possibly using our brain power and our resources and our influence to maybe coordinate a system like that, right, could help reduce some of that barrier. And thirdly, I think that oftentimes just simply being a safe space where people can talk about those issues can be the first step towards getting them into services that are needed. Does that make sense? So maybe just being a safe space where you, and then being familiar with those resources yourself, right? So we have Coleman, we have ComQuest, we have AVO. There's a myriad of different providers here locally. Just get familiar with them, understand them, and then be able to do a soft referral if you need to with them. Does that make sense? So I think those are three things that you can do. I don't have an answer as far as like how do you get people into mental health providing or substance use providing, because there's barriers significantly there as well, right? So for me, I was in school for a CDCA, Chemical Dependency Counseling Assistant. In March of 2020, they passed a legislative act called the Licensure Expansion Act. This Licensure Expansion Act was designed to open up different licensed fields. On the back side of that, though, there was actually qualifications that eliminated people like myself from being able to be a practicing licensing professional for a lifetime. So my offense was attempted aggravated murder. Okay, I committed that at 16 years old. My offense was a lifetime exclusion from being licensed through the Ohio Chemical Dependency Board. Somebody who has, I'm trying to think of an offense that was on there that's safe to say in this room. There was an offense on there that was like exploitation of minors. Does everybody know what that is? Okay. That was only a 5-year limitation. Does it make any sense to anybody? No, I didn't think so. Okay, it didn't make sense to me either. And I also have that piece of paper, that document, if you'd like to see that. I do have that so you can understand the nuances of that. Those barriers make it hard for people to access mental health and substance use, right? So I don't have an answer for that per se, other than advocate, go down to the state capitol, possibly, march down there, rally down there and say, hey, this needs to change. That's the only way I know how to get it to change, because policy is a thing. And they pass actually collateral consequences. Is anybody familiar with that term? Collateral consequences, collateral sanctions. So those are essentially the barriers that people encounter post-release. That's what a collateral consequence is. Usually we would think in our mind in a criminal justice system, when you get sentenced to prison, that's your punishment, right? That's what we think. There's actually, I think, let me get this right. There's 40,000+ collateral sanctions. I think the number is 44, but I'm not sure. I know there's 40+. 40,000+ collateral consequences or sanctions for people who have come home from prison that they encounter every single day. As of August of 2022 to August of 2023, 1,274 collateral sanctions were passed in that time. A 1-year span. Yes, ma'am.
Define collateral.
Collateral is, so it's essentially a post-conviction sanction or consequence. So it's after I've sat my time in prison, I've come home, I've paid my quote-unquote debt to society, that's how we term it. I come home and still have these other barriers, these other sanctions, these other rules that keep me from accessing certain things in society. Does that make a little bit more sense? It's a lot, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Perhaps one that we're more familiar with, or most familiar with in this room, be the sanction of, for certain crimes, not being able to vote.
Yeah. So that actually changed. That's no longer a sanction, but for certain crimes, right?
And in some states.
Yeah, some states, absolutely. Here in Ohio, we no longer have that. But yes, that would be one that we're most familiar with. Think about this. Did anybody ever live in an apartment here ever in their lives? Okay, I'm just making sure I'm in a room with people who can relate. So when you first apply for an apartment, to rent an apartment from somebody, what are some of the criteria they ask you to make you eligible? If you're employed? Pets, okay, give me another one. Age and income, absolutely. There's one that we probably overlook every time that we hear it because it doesn't pertain to us. Criminal background. Collateral sanction. Collateral sanction. Background check, absolutely. And what's the intention behind a background check? Absolutely, absolutely. So does that all make sense now? Are we starting to connect the dots a little bit? These are collateral consequences and sanctions, okay? Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Does that make a little bit more sense? Awesome. There's more data. I can send this PowerPoint out later. The data is a lot. You'd get overwhelmed. I do this for a living, so I can run the numbers and do all of that stuff. But there's a couple of ones that I do want to point out. About half of those who are most frequently arrested had annual incomes below $10,000. How many of us could live off $10,000 a year? Okay. 85% had incomes below $20,000. How many of us could live off of $20,000 a year right now? 85% of people coming home from prison below $20,000. Educational attainment was the lowest among people who had 3 or more arrests per year. So an arrest is simply just going to your county jail. That could be for a DUI, it could be for unruly conduct, it could be for a myriad of things. But 3 of those or more in a year, 74% of those individuals who fall under that category had a high school education or less. So you talk about a barrier, here's another one. How would I fill out paperwork for mental health services and substance use services, and I don't even hardly know how to read or write? 38% of those individuals didn't even have a high school diploma. People with 3 or more arrests were more likely to have been diagnosed with chronic health conditions. I think this is just important when we're talking about social determinants of health. A lot of people have chronic health issues that keep them from, normal everyday activities, right? And then add to the nuance of it, now I gotta go see my parole officer, I gotta go to this class, I gotta get a job, all of these requirements that come down as soon as you come home from prison. And I got a chronic health issue that I can't even get addressed because I got to fulfill these things before I go back to prison. Those are issues. So I just wanted to put a little bit of face behind the data. I had 4 people that were supposed to be here, so I figured I'd put some information about a few of them into the PowerPoint. My brother Al, man, this is a guy who discipled me in prison. I told you there was 3 men specifically who discipled me in prison. This happens to be one of them. And actually, that picture up there in the left-hand corner is him with my youngest daughter, London. We did a leadership retreat for our young Christian professionals, and that was him there. But he's a father. He has children that he had before he got incarcerated for doing 27 years, too. He's also a husband. He was married 17 years while in prison, got married to his bride in prison. He's an entrepreneur. He's a mentor. He mentored me. He's a grandfather. His kids went on to have other kids. He's also an author. He's wrote a lot of books. But he spent, I said 25 years. I try to round down anytime I get in that weird nuance. But 27 years total, wrongfully convicted for a murder he did not commit. Think about spending 25 years of your life in prison for something you did not do. And you telling people you did not do it and they don't care. Add to that the myriad of things he has had to encounter since coming home in 2020. Throughout his time, him and his wife remained committed and even mentored other couples navigating committed relationships while incarcerated. This is actually one of the curriculums that we use through young Christian professionals. It's called 3 Strands, 1 Cord, biblically based, all designed for married and committed couples to really truly walk through their relationships together while incarcerated. How many of you all, if your spouse got incarcerated, you'd stick with them? Good. Do you know how to do that? Yeah. So that's why this program matters. Because somebody who's literally walked in those shoes and did it for 17 years is giving us play-by-play how to do that in a way that's healthy and Christ-centered. My guy, Truck, his real name is Kevin. His nickname is Truck. This guy was actually a tutor through Ashland University while in prison. He helped college graduates, just make sure that their studies were up to par, stuff like that. Helped them get to the graduate level. He was also a coach. He coached for anybody familiar with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes? He was a coach for a softball team in Richland Correctional Institution under the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. He was a dedicated employee. He works 2 jobs currently. He works at a homeless shelter and at a factory as a supervisor. He's currently in a land contract with his landlord to own his home in 15 years. He's a caretaker for his mother and father. His father actually just passed away, not this week, but the week before. But he's also a supervisor, but he served 15 years for robbery due to his addiction, right? So these are the faces behind the data. I want us to understand that these people are people. They're not just numbers. And then, wait, there's a little bit more. Here is a group of men from all walks of life, all types of ethnicities, all kinds of religions. You see people in there wearing kufis, right? That's Islam. But they're all doing it together to grow, to learn, and honestly to come out better men. And each of these men in these pictures represent a family. They represent children. They represent a community, and much, much more. This is some of our classes here in Richland Correctional Institution. And then this is me. At 16 years old, I was incarcerated. That's me up there talking to my lawyer and the bailiff getting ready to take me away. I went to college in prison. I'm finishing my college degree as we speak. I led groups and Bible studies and classes while in prison. I became a director of education for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I came home at 26 and lost all my support when I was in prison. My mother passed away from cancer. My father, he's 72 years old and is in prison right now as we speak. And then I came home and married the most amazing woman I've ever met. My wife, I don't know how she says yes to me every single day, but she does by God's grace. And now I get to be the father of 2 beautiful daughters. Those 2 daughters right there in the left-hand corner picture. My youngest, London, is who my wife is holding, and then my oldest is Brooklyn. So I wanted you to see that, yeah, I did time in prison, and I came home transformed, different, new. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things become new. Do we believe that? Like really believe that? We can hear that in our minds and know it's true. But in our hearts, when we see somebody like me, first day home, I say, guess what, man? My life's new. I'm no longer who I once was. Do we believe that? Are we willing to walk with somebody through that? Some next steps, you can create, clear-cut systems. I think that's always helpful, right? How many of us, when we call our Medicaid provider or Medicare provider, how many of us think that's a clear-cut system? Okay, cool. I'm just making sure. So, yeah, exactly. So people can relate. Amen. Absolutely. Hallelujah. But that's the challenge. Think about how frustrated you get sitting on that phone with Medicaid or Medicare. Now add somebody who's never had to have these services, the same frustrations, the same barriers, trying to navigate them. With no support, I gotta go back to work, I'm calling on my lunch break. If I don't get this done, my PO is gonna lock me up. Creating clear-cut systems can help reduce some of those barriers. Reduce the strictness and blanketed background checks, right? We just talked about it. One of the natural questions is, do you have a criminal background? Both for housing and employment. The top 2 needs. Let's reduce that. If we own property or we are landlords and we rent property, like it starts with you. Take it off your screening process. Deal with people on an individualized basis. Because guess what? I would venture to say, if you looked at my record, you'd be like, ain't no way I'm renting to him. I'm a homeowner now, though, because somebody was willing to give me a chance in an apartment. Expand your social services. So we all have social services. We all do things, and we all want to be a part of doing good work in the community. Expand that a little bit. Reach out. Stretch your horizons. Maybe that's as simple as, creating a support group for citizens and people, family members that are walking with loved ones that are justice involved. Maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe it's as simple as having a meal once a month to celebrate people that are coming home from prison. We already do meals. Why not just have one for people specifically coming home from prison or a loved one walking with that person? Maybe it's as simple as putting together 72-hour bags of hygiene, right? And saying, hey, for the first 72 hours, we got you. Maybe it's as simple as having a fund or a pool of funds that says, hey, you know what? We're going to be able to give them access to pay off their reinstatement fees or help them make little trivial fixes to their cars. Maybe they just need a new set of tires in order for their car to be able to be up and running. Put a fund to the side for that and help people get to that place where they can be stable and thriving on their own. And then, of course, always investing. I'm a firm believer in investing in the kingdom of God, which also means investing in the things of God. And that's just investing in restoration of justice-involved people through employment. If you work or you have a place of business that you oversee, open up your employment to them. There's some possibilities that they could probably be I worked in Columbus for 4 years. I've never called off sick, and I've never missed a day. 4 years. And I was a bivocational pastor as well. I'm ventured to say people that are justice involved will probably be your best employees. Yes, sir.
Quick question, Stanley. Referring back to the numbers, you said there were like 2,500 people coming out of the penal system into Stark County every year, and your participation was 600 and something?
524.
Okay. This is a voluntary program.
Absolutely.
So those that are in your program are there because they want to be and they want the services your group is providing.
Absolutely.
You have a sense of the recidivism rate of those 600?
Yep, absolutely.
And can you, if it's possible, just give us a quick nuts and bolts of what you do when that person comes back into Stark County?
Yeah, great question. So first, the recidivism rate. Out of those 524 individuals that get services, 87% of them stay home. 87% stay home. So roughly 15% go back to prison. So that number, let me just do basic math here. Let me take the number here. Give me a second. Pull up my calculator. So we do 524, multiply that by, we'll do 0.13 because I think that's the only right way to do it. So roughly 68% of them, 68 of them will go back. 68 of them out of 524 go back. So that's what? Roughly 420 of them stay home. And then what we do on a nuts and bolts level when they come back home from prison is essentially we work with them. We create, while they're in the institution, we create that relationship so that way when they come home, they're not coming home to an unfamiliar face. We do programming. We have discipleship courses. We have a seminary school that's free to them that we do in the prisons. It's a 4-year seminary school designed to equip them to pastor and do stuff in churches and all of that. But then once they come home, we've worked through them with a reentry plan. So we've talked about everything from how are you going to get your ID? How are you going to go back and get your license? Where are you planning on working? Where are you going to live? How are you going to have clothes on your back? Where are you going to get your food for the first 30 days? We work through an entire plan that we make sure they have all of those needs met. Who's your support system? Where are you going to be going to church? All of those things. We work that plan out. So essentially we take the top need priority. First, you're going to need an ID and birth certificate. Can't do nothing without that, right? Can't get a job, can't get a place. So let's go ahead and get that out the way. Right now in Ohio, if you're over 18, you can get your ID for free. So we take them right down to the BMV. So sometimes we pick them up from prison and take them right to the BMV to get their ID. We'll oftentimes, if they don't have access to a cell phone, we'll go through Q-Link, one of those free or Assurance Wireless, help get them access to a free phone. Since they have Medicaid, they're eligible. So we try to get them access to a free phone. Some of them come home. There's a weird nuance in that, but some of them come home and don't have access to Medicaid. So we'll buy them a phone, give them the first 30 days paid for. That way they can at least call employers, stuff like that. They cost $50 at Walmart. You buy a $50 phone, $50 fulfillment card or whatever they call it, and they got a phone service for a month. So from there, we take them down to our office. We have clothes, we have hygiene. We make sure they get that. If they're from another part in the state, say for example, we have a Cleveland director. He has the same resources up there, partnering with local churches, trying to provide those things. We make sure that if they need a hotel stay to kind of bridge the gap to figure out where they're going to stay, we'll help pay for that a little bit. We do try to work with landlords to help get them housing. We have partnerships with employers that we help get them jobs as well. So that's kind of what we do from there. On the spiritual side, we do have disciple makers that walk with people 18 months after they've been released. And essentially, it's one time a week, they make connections. And they're checking in to see, hey, what's Jesus doing in your life? How are you growing in Christ? And what's one area you want to be more like Jesus? Those are the 3 questions that they ask every single week to make sure that they're following Christ in every area of their life. That's 18 months, a year and a half after they've been incarcerated. They can keep that relationship going if they choose to, all of it voluntary. But when people walk through our door, that's something that we try to make sure that they're aware of. We do support groups every Wednesday night, 6 to 7:30. There's a support group right there at Crossroads. We do support groups for loved ones and families. We do premarital counseling. We marry couples when they come home if they need to. Basically, it's all life. Every area of life, whatever they say they want and need services with, that's what we try to provide. We're essentially just a community trying to provide the resources that aren't available to people.
How many of you are there?
75 across the entire state of Ohio. So 75 of us, all volunteers, give our lives to this work because we believe in it and we're passionate about it. We're hoping to expand that as more people come home. But, also one of our mission is to, equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So we go into churches, we got workshops where, how do you create an environment that's conducive to inviting people back? We work with, specific churches that want to partner with us in our seminary school to provide pastors and lay people that can do the work of the ministry as well. So that's our hope to expand that a little bit, if that makes sense. Great questions. Yes, sir.
Jim. I know you've got a
Stan, so where are they coming from? How many are coming from county jail versus state prison versus wherever else they might come from?
Great question. So everybody in your local county jail, I'd say except for 2% of the people in your local county jail, I think the number was 174 Stark County Jail can hold. So 2% of that, roughly probably 10 people, right, are not going to come back home. So that's about roughly 160 people, no matter what, however many times that door revolves, 160 people are coming back to this society from your county jail. All the numbers that I've just given you are straight from state prisons. State prisons are all across, there's 27 of them in the state of Ohio. So they're coming from anywhere from Toledo, Northeast Pre-Release Center in Cleveland, ORW down in Marysville. They could be coming from Pickaway, which is closer to Columbus. They could be coming from Lebanon, Belmont, all over the state of Ohio. They could be coming right back here. How many of those from different counties are coming back here? I'm not 100% sure. What I do know is the process for the Adult Parole Authority, who kind of gives the reentry plan from the DRC standpoint. They make it so that essentially your first plan of reentry is to come back to the county in which you committed your crime. So that's your first plan of action from the DRC standpoint. In my case and scenario, it didn't work for me because I had no support there whatsoever. So then we opened up the umbrella to some other areas. Ultimately, they made the choice for me, and I ended up in Mansfield, Ohio. So can't really give you specific numbers as far as outside of the county, but I can tell you that the process is designed for the first place of release is to be the county of offense. Hopefully that answered your question somewhat. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, an issue, is it issue one, pardon my ignorance, there's issue one and issue two on the ballot. The one is, I believe, making marijuana legal.
Issue 1.
What are your,
Oh,
issue two?
Sorry. Yes,
I'm
yes,
sorry.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
issue two is, okay, making, what are your views from your background on that? What are your views on legalizing marijuana?
Yeah, I would say my personal opinion, I preface personal opinion, I myself was addicted to marijuana, so I'm against it because I've been addicted to it. I think it's a psychological addiction and isn't a physical addiction like heroin is, where my body didn't crave it, but I knew I had a bad day if I didn't have it. Does that make sense? Similar to coffee, right? If we don't have coffee, sometimes we're grunt butts, right? That's how it was for me with marijuana. I think it can also potentially be a slippery slope for people, right? So I think it can start with marijuana and it can lead to a myriad of other things. One of the things that I always tell people is that like street drugs are now, all of them are being laced with fentanyl, flat out. And I got fentanyl test strips for people who are actively using street drugs so that they don't die, right? Marijuana being one of those street drugs. So that's my personal opinion. I would say the research shows if it's produced in a lab, it's more safe because it does not now have to be laced with fentanyl because a lab is producing it. Number 2, I think they can put a lot of restrictions on that. So you can't over purchase. You can't purchase at a certain age, those kinds of restrictions. I think that's helpful. And then thirdly, I think in that same vein, research shows there are literally, I think, 27% of people who are incarcerated are for a marijuana offense. If you legalize it, those people would be released, you know? I mean, marijuana has always been around. We've smoked marijuana literally since we've been a nation. And I think legalizing it helps reduce the criminalization of it. And so therefore now people have an opportunity to live a life based on a crime that, honestly, if you look at it, there are severely other worse crimes happening that people are being released from prison from. So if you release people that have marijuana charges, I think you can give people hope, which is ultimately our goal as believers in Jesus. You're welcome. Great questions. Any other questions, comments, things that people want to know? I know there was a question last week that I want to make sure I answered.
Okay, last one, Stanley.
Yeah, this is about Social Security. Do people that have been incarcerated for perhaps 50% of their working life and they become 62, do they get penalized because they can't get very much Social Security?
Absolutely. So essentially, they would get whatever the bare minimum Social Security is because they haven't contributed. Does that make sense? So because they haven't contributed, they can't draw out more. So retirement is not an option for them. They're going to have to work for the remainder of their lives. And I would even say sometimes they can't even get Social Security. Yep. Sometimes they can't even get Social Security. And here's why I know that's true. There was a guy who came home. He was 75. He did 43 years in prison for a crime he did commit. Let me be clear on that. He came home, ended up trying to get Social Security. They denied him based on not having ever contributed. That's what they denied him for. So that was a personal experience that I was familiar of. That was one. I don't want to make a blanket statement about the entire system based on one individual, but that individual right now, he's 75. I think he's been home 3 years, 76, and he's still driving truck. That was what his craft was. So